Education, housing, employment, criminal justice, all of these categories have obvious racial deficits. The only arguable exception is political participation, where, I think everybody's seen this data. It's really quite dramatic. We have great participation in the elections. We have people who run for office and they get elected, and that's a tremendous success story, no question about it. But that result is due to a large extent to the operation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the most significant piece of civil rights legislation we've ever had. Last year this time, the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act was presented to the United States Supreme Court, and the issue was, should it be struck down? We, the Legal Defense Fund, it was our case. We argued in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did not strike down the Voting Rights Act. But for that, I would be giving you a different answer to the political participation. Okay? I would give you a completely different answer to that. So, are we a post-racial society? Not yet. But what about poverty? Much, perhaps most of what I just described as evidence of us not being post-racial focuses on poor inner-city Black communities and Latino communities, often characterized by persistent poverty. Race is a really enormous vector, for sure, but what about poverty? What about economic and social justice? Let me come back to Charles Houston, the person I mentioned at the beginning, the architect of the Legal Defense Fund's mission. Charles Houston was one of the greatest legal minds of the 20th century. He was the first Black editor of the Harvard Law Review. Felix Frankfurter was his law professor and his friend for life. Dean Pound thought he was one of the best students that ever went to Harvard Law School. He is the dean that transformed Howard Law School into a full-time accredited law school. A law school whose mission he created as well, and that mission was to transform our entire country into a just society. And he was the first full-time legal counsel at the NAACP. He was a spectacular advocate. He argued and won in the Supreme Court the first cases on the way to Brown. He argued Missouri versus Keynes, which I mentioned. He argued Shelley versus Kramer. Thurgood Marshall was his star student at Howard, his colleague in many of those cases, and his successor. Charles Houston died in 1950, before Brown. He was lawyer handling the DC version of Brown, but he died before that actually grew into the case that went to the Supreme Court. So he died in 1950, but before Brown, but clearly inside of Brown. The year before he died, in 1949, Charles Houston looked back on his decades of struggle. This is Charles Houston, 1949. There come times when it is possible to forecast the results of a contest, of a battle, of a lawsuit, all before the final event has taken place. So far as our struggle for civil rights is concerned, the struggle for civil rights is won. What I am more concerned about is that the Negro shall not be content simply with demanding an equal share in the existing system. It seems to me that his historical challenge is to make sure that the system that shall survive in the United States of America shall be a system which guarantees justice and freedom for everyone. So, where are we with respect to issues of poverty? That's what he's talking about. There are millions of white children who are also failed by the schools that I mentioned earlier, who do not get the education necessary to actually thrive in our economy. There are millions of white men and women who've seen their jobs eliminated and their prospects for future employment grow dim. And in our culture, any man and any woman who is suffering through persistent unemployment feels less than a part of we the people. You feel outside of our society. There are common interests with respect to how poverty affects people of all races. And either those issues will unite all of us, or they'll be used to keep us divided. That's how they were used 100 years ago, to put a wedge right between the populist movement and turn it into a white populist movement that embraced white supremacy. Charles Houston could see the end of the legal battle in Brown, but the larger battle was to ensure that there was, quote, a system that guarantees freedom and justice for everyone, race and poverty. Race is our most challenging problem, but we make a grave mistake in not seeing it in the broader context of social and economic rights. Often in conversations just like this, we are led to believe that we must choose and make a priority here. Race or poverty, which are you? Race people over there, poverty people over there. It's a false choice. We have to figure out how to address both of these issues. I was counsel in Michigan cases, Cross and Grutter. And I often summarize the decision with a quote that Justice O'Connor has in the opinion. Nothing less than the nation's future depends upon leaders trained through wide exposure to the ideas and mores of students as diverse as this nation of many peoples. It's a magnificent quote. In response to that, I get this pushback. But can't a school just use socioeconomic factors to achieve diversity? Why help a black student who's not poor? The answer is what I've been saying this morning. We have issues of race, we have issues of poverty. That they may both affect the same person doesn't mean that they are not separate and very serious problems. That race may affect a person but not poverty, or that poverty could affect a person and not race, does not mean that either is any less serious. And we ignore these fundamental realities at our peril. Black people are disproportionately impoverished. They are very disproportionately categorized and characterized as being in persistent poverty. I started out by saying that we are more comfortable talking about poverty than race due to our horrendous history of race. Here's the other side. Because race is the elephant in the room in a discussion of poverty, I think sometimes we're unwilling to have discussions about structural ways to eliminate poverty. It bounces both ways. We're a rich country that tolerates inexcusable poverty. When I was going through the categories that I suggested would be useful in determining whether or not we were post-racial, I left one out on purpose because we've been in the middle of this debate for the last year. Healthcare. Okay, that's another category you would use. We've been locked in what seems like an endless shouting match that is hard to listen to anymore over healthcare insurance for over a year. So, for many poor people who have Medicaid, this discussion is simply irrelevant. For they have health insurance. They have Medicaid. Even if Medicaid, their reimbursement isn't adequate, they have Medicaid. But for them, there's a far more serious problem. They don't have health care. And they don't have health care because there are no doctors where they live or even close by. And there are no hospitals where they live or even close by. And there are no clinics where they live or even close by. They may have health care insurance, but they don't have health care. And that would be a category that you would also look at to figure out where you are. That tracks on race lines, that tracks on poverty lines. I think we're at a very important moment. I've spent a lot of time going over the development of rights in connection with race to make this point. Those rights were created. They were created by aggressive lawyers backed by political action. Today, poor people have programs, but few enforceable rights. Is there a right to education? Is there a right to health care? right not to be hungry, a right to dignified work. How about indigent defense? Programs matter, but rights give you power, and power makes you appear. We're not post-racial, but we're also not post-poverty. These structural problems need to be approached in tandem. We the people has to include all of the people. I want to end by returning to something I said earlier. Lawyers are an empowered profession. I think a lot of lawyers did not notice that about themselves. There's no other profession that is empowered. There's no other profession that can call on the power of the state to enforce things that we do. In asserting rights and fashioning new rights, we the lawyers can call on the power of the state to vindicate those rights. That empowers our clients. The Legal Defense Fund empowered Black people and many other minority groups, but we also empowered poor people. As far as we have come in matters of race, we still face daunting challenges. Problems of race in education and employment, housing, healthcare, criminal justice, all require structural change. The problems of poverty in education, employment, housing, healthcare, and criminal justice all require structural changes. Access to quality education should not correlate with wealth. Access to quality healthcare should not correlate with wealth, nor should justice. I think lawyers have special responsibilities that come from our empowered status. It is more than standing for the rule of law. It is standing for the rule of just law. Black and white, Latino, Asian American, and Native American, men and women, straight and gay, rich and poor, all of us. I believe all of us must play a role in transforming our society into the inclusive democracy it must become. Let's get to work.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and very important speech. We were able to take a few questions, probably about 5, if people have any questions for Mr. Payton or Judge Henderson. Yes, Doug.
Thank you for the consideration. And the question I have is, has to do with the 13th Amendment. And whether that may serve as a vehicle for raising most of the issues of injustice that you've addressed. And I guess my question is, I've always read Brown v. Boyd as not only a 14th Amendment equal protection case, but as a 13th Amendment badge and incident of slavery case. And I just wonder whether the Inc. Fund considers the 13th Amendment to be a remedy not only for addressing, but even more importantly, for educating courts and the public about the connection of the lingering vestiges of slavery today?
That's a really good question. I've read the entire argument in Brown. It's argued twice. And you can find it online. And if you haven't done it, you will be surprised. It's sensational reading. The argument that Thurgood Marshall makes, that he says has been conceded and cannot be challenged by the other side, is a version of this argument. What we have before us, he says, is nothing other than the black codes. That's what racial segregation in the schools comes from. It's the black codes. And those 2 amendments were designed explicitly to overturn the black codes. I've heard nothing that says that this can be distinguished from that. He says it just like that, okay? I think that the challenge, that freaked the court out. Okay, so he wins, but there is no rationale for how they get to their decision at all. Okay? And I want to explain why that is and sort of what the challenge of thinking this through is right now. When Brown is decided, there are no laws that prohibit discrimination in employment or in housing or in voting, or that say that you can't have a category that is black job only, white job only. There are no such laws at all. Okay, it's an era where it should catch you a little bit off guard. The anti-discrimination principle is a principle that comes out of the civil rights movement. It's not present in Brown, and they do not invoke it. Okay, the court in Brown is making a decision inside of white supremacy. Okay, inside of it, doesn't have a choice. So the question in thinking through what the vitality is that can be sucked from the 13th Amendment has to take this into account. It is hard to fashion the argument that doesn't sound like you were saying something today is slavery, and it is hard to sell that. Okay, so you have to make an argument that people say, I got that, as opposed to an argument where people say, you know, you're not claiming you're a slave today. This actually, you got to really work it through. So you got to figure out what the 13th Amendment is all about. Okay, you have to figure it, and I'm going to give you one other little strange story. The 13th Amendment, you guys have it so you can pull it out and read it to me? Does someone have it? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States except for conviction of a crime, right? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. I was at a conference at Harvard talking about this with a guy named Blackman, writes for the Wall Street Journal. Wrote a terrific book called Slavery by Another Name. It's a terrific book. And I then summarized what his book was about, and Justice O'Connor was sitting right there. And I said, you know, his book is about what part of it, what that phrase, nor involuntary servitude, is doing in there. Okay? Well, what's it doing in there? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. Here's what it's doing in there. Before the Civil War, the southern states tried to sell their prisoners to businesses. And before the Civil War, that would have meant all white males, because there are no black men in prison in the South. They're all slaves. And the law was that it violated a fundamental right for someone to be forced to work against their will. That's involuntary servitude. During the Civil War, the South needed ironworks, and the way they ran their ironworks was to actually buy slaves and run the Birmingham ironworks. And after the Civil War, they ran the same ironworks by actually using black convicts. And if that phrase isn't in the 13th Amendment, you can't do it. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. Question?
I enjoyed your presentation. I wonder if you have some ideas of concrete steps that those folks in the room, teachers, students, and individuals like myself, who are lawyers out there practicing, what kinds of things we might do in the next year, 2 years, 5 years to improve the situation, to actually make things better?
Well, when I said it's, you have to think about the structural changes, I meant that. And the example I gave of healthcare, I intended as an example to help think things through. What would you do if you wanted to put in place structural things that could help us redistribute healthcare professionals? You can't order doctors to go live over there. You can't do that. But creative lawyers can think of pretty creative ways to create incentives to actually get doctors to do that. What if your entire loan, right? What if the entire loan actually goes away if you're willing to spend 3 years or 5 years over there? if you say the spirit in this room to seek racial and social justice is really infectious, I think doctors are a very noble profession as well, and a lot of them go outside the country to do really good things. Why don't we try to create some way to channel those kinds of things so that in fact it helps bring us together as a democracy in ways that are actually quite significant. Some people that do things like that never leave. Okay? So my example is, you figure out something, and it's not healthcare insurance. It really isn't healthcare insurance. It is healthcare. I think we see some spirit like that you see in Teach for America, and you have to figure out how that gets directed in a way that actually creates a structural change, and it's not just a rite of passage. But I don't have a magic bullet here, but I think the enthusiasm and commitment can be turned into very focused efforts to actually identify wholesale change, structural change, not one by one, structural change. The impact of the Chicago case that I hope I win in the Supreme Court will be that the next city will never do what Chicago did. Okay, so that's the structural change. Chicago used an exam it now concedes was racially discriminatory over and over again. No city will ever do that. Okay? We got to figure out the structural changes we can make that affect issues of poverty and issues of race. Issues of poverty and issues of race. And the reason I went over the categories is I believe the categories are almost the complete categories. So if you pick out those categories, structural change in those categories has enormous leverage in changing our society. Yeah.
I love your presentation. Absolutely wonderful. A request the next time you do it, near the end, where you said black and white, straight and gay, think about adding able and disabled. Everything you said about the prison.
Oh, I'll do it. I'll do it. I got it. That's good. That's good. I missed that. Okay. Last question. Okay.
I'd like to hear both of your thoughts about the events that have happened at the University of California, San Diego in recent weeks with respect to Black History Month. There was a noose put in the library, there was a KKK hood put on one of the statues, as well as a Compton cookout party.
I'm familiar with what happened, and I'd say we have incidents like that all over this country every year. I think that they almost embarrass us. How could that have happened today, we say, in California, in San Diego? How could that have happened today? It's the wrong question. The way you make sure things like that don't happen is you have very robustly diverse student bodies, and those things don't happen. You know, if there's something that, the reason I like that quote from Justice O'Connor, and it's a paraphrase of Justice Powell and Bakke, is that it really does give the answer to that. Nothing less than the nation's future depends upon leaders trained through wide exposure to the ideas and morals of students as diverse as this nation of many peoples. When you keep people separate, they can think anything up about you. I told this story to folks about I spent many years litigating Scopes 2. It's not a case about race, it's Scopes 2. It's about Tennessee, again, trying to litigate what can be in the textbooks. And this was a case brought by Jerry Falwell, one of the arms of his empire, to challenge the textbooks that were being used in the schools in East Tennessee. If you don't know East Tennessee, it has only small towns, no big cities. You fly into an airport that's called Tri-Cities, and then you drive to someplace. And it is a remarkably homogeneous place. There are no Jews, there are no Catholics, there are no black people. Everyone is born-again Christian. Our federal judge had to say on the first day of the trial, he just wanted everyone to know that he too was a born-again Christian. He didn't want to have to move. He wanted everybody to know that. And I deposed all of the plaintiffs. And I deposed all of the kids. And And I heard them tell me what was terrifying them about society outside. And they had stories about Catholics and Jews and black people and why they shouldn't be in their readers. And I could say, but do you know a Catholic? And they'd say, no. I said, do you know a Jew? No. No black man besides me? No. Well, how do you know? The next question's a waste of time. Next question's a waste of time. You know, they think they know something, but they know it only through fear. And that's really powerful stuff, when all you think you know is fear. And they are acting out on that. And they are a different place if, in fact, you change their schools, if you change where they are. And, in fact, their parents are terrified that if their kids leave, they'll never come back. Their parents are correct. On that, their parents are correct. If they leave, they'll never come back. You know, we still, you know, when I say that we are more racially concentrated, more racially divided in some sense than we were 50 years ago, not in every sense. But that means that the people that you know about turn out to be very narrow band. And what happens in colleges and even in law schools is misleading. Most people don't have an experience like this one. You know, they don't. They live in things where it's a narrow band of people, and they think yes about everybody else. Or, far worse, they think they know something from movies and TV. In Law and Order, there are more murders on Law and Order than there are in New York City. So a lot of people think they know a lot about, you know, crime out there through Law and Order, because that's what they know. So I hear the point about San Diego, but don't let it just be the narrow point about San Diego. It's a measure of what we still have to accomplish as a society.